Welcome to week 2. We're going to talk about the collection life cycle. I want to tell you a story about a now retired colleague of mine that was a department head of a big metropolitan library, which we will remain nameless. She was asked by a library board member when the staff would be done buying books for the library. So he was under the impression that the library added materials until the shelves were full, and then voila, they were finished. No need to buy any more books. So my colleague kept her cool, and she told him that the library never stops buying materials. Information goes out of date, books get damaged, people's taste change, and publishers offer more each year. So various departments, as well as the public, interact with the collection in different ways. Each contributes to the collection quality. There are 8 stages in the collection life cycle, and this lecture describes the stages of the life cycle in detail and how they relate to each other in holistic collection management. Here is our very simple model of the collection life cycle. Regardless of the size, the type, or the mission, all libraries follow this life cycle. They select and acquire, then catalog, process, and shelve the item. Eventually, the books become outdated, damaged, irrelevant, and then we go back to selection and acquisitions. All sections of the life cycle are equally important. It can be really easy to get caught up in selection because shopping is fun, right? And ignoring the rest of the life cycle. So in larger libraries, whole other departments may be responsible for the different parts of the life cycle. Specialty and research collections might have, emphasize repair and preservation rather than weeding. Regardless, the basic life cycle is in place no matter what kind of institution or collection we are discussing. So keep this cycle in mind, and understanding the entire process is key to managing a quality collection. At the top of the collection life cycle is selection. Selectors have to decide which materials best match their library's mission and policies and stick to a budget. Libraries of all types often assign specific selectors to specific collections, so one person makes the final selections for their assigned collections. This gives selectors a sense of ownership of a collection and encourages a deep understanding and a familiarity with their assigned areas. It's important to put a person in charge of each collection who can oversee its management and who can make any executive decisions, what gets weeded, what gets repaired, things like that. A managed collection is one that is watched, worked with, and understood. There are also benefits to collaboration in selection. When there's only one person making decisions for a collection, it can become stagnant or a reflection of one person's philosophy or interests or opinions. By assigning collaborators, wider viewpoints are reflected in the collection. Inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, IDEA, figure prominently in the selection phase of the collection life cycle. If the collection management policy and collection objectives prioritize diverse books and authors, selectors need to follow through on that promise. The ability to select materials that are diverse and inclusive is challenging because of the sheer lack of diversity in publishing. In 2019, there was a diversity baseline study, Lee and Low books. There's a link to that in the module. They revealed shocking statistics. 97% of publishing staff identify as cisgender men or women, 76% identify as white or Caucasian, 81% identify as straight or heterosexual, 89% identify as non-disabled. So as the authors of the study point out, this is a quote directly from that study. The book industry has the power to shape culture in big and small ways. The people behind the books serve as gatekeepers who can make a huge difference in determining which stories are amplified and which are shut out. If the people who work in publishing are not a diverse group, how can diverse voices truly be represented in its books? End quote. So Similarly, there was a study in 2019 by the Cooperative Children's Book Center. They released a survey results on diversity in youth literature. The report, again, this is another quote, the report breaks down the number of children's and YA books by and about BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, and people of color, from the previous year, end quote. Out of 3,716 books that they surveyed, the main characters were 11.9% Black or African, 1% First Nations or Native Nations, 8.7% Asian or Asian American, 5.3% Latinx, 0.05% Pacific Islander, 41.8% white, 29.2% animal or non-human characters, 3.1% LGBTQ, and 3.4% disabled. So, there's more non-human characters in publishing than most of these other diverse categories combined. That was in 2019. It's a little easier now. I think the publishing industry has recognized this because of these surveys. They've done some work. It's getting better. There's a long ways to go. So where do you find diverse books? We've created a page in this week's module with links to all kinds of blogs and book review sites for diverse books. So I hope you'll give that a look. It used to be, and in some cases still is, frowned upon to add self-published or print-on-demand books to library collections. The concern was always quality. They may or may not have been professionally edited, and they weren't published by the big, well-known, established publishing houses. So they were just lesser-known materials, and the quality was often brought into question because they weren't vetted by folks with industry credentials. So libraries are now encouraged to include a statement in their collection management policy about selecting self-published and print-on-demand titles. So Robin Bradford pointed out in a Library Journal article, quote, "Once upon a time, self-published books were considered inferior to traditionally published books, no matter the particulars. It's time to set that aside and acquire books from a diverse array of authors on the merit of the work, not by who brought it to the market," end quote. And that article is linked in the module. We saw on the last slide how non-diverse the publishing industry is. So self-published and print-on-demand materials are one strategy to find works by more diverse authors. Libraries need to decide how self-published and print-on-demand works will fit into their collection goals and include their plan in the collection management policy and the collection objectives. So let's talk about how to decide what to buy. And we'll start with the format box. For example, if an audiobook exists as a book on tape, a book on CD, a playaway, at one time there was an MP3 disc format, there's downloadable audio, what will you buy in which format? A major bestseller may require you to have one or two different audio formats and the print copies. So turnover rates and circulation benchmarks are helpful to make decisions for future purchases and also knowing when to stop buying in a certain format. Electronic versus print. You have to decide how many copies in which format are needed. What formats are popular with which authors. Maybe certain authors lend themselves well to certain demographics, and those demographics are more statistically users of one format or another. You have to pay attention to those kinds of criteria. Standing orders can help you keep up with constantly published items. For example, those Rainbow Magic books, the James Patterson books, the annual travel guides, things like that. You don't have to think about, these titles at all with a standing order. They just show up. It's a beautiful thing because, James Patterson has a new book every 5 minutes. It's really easy to miss one. You'll never miss one if you just set a standing order with Ingram or Baker and Taylor or whoever your vendor is. They all have standing order plans. And you say, if James Patterson publishes a new book, we want 3 copies or 2 copies or whatever your thing is, you set how it's going to work for you. But then you don't have to think about it. It just shows up. You do have to keep your eye on these though and cancel them when they're no longer relevant. They're easy to forget about. The question about how often should you buy suggestions from patrons, we say whenever possible. If a patron is requesting something, it's a guaranteed use. They're alerting you to something that they think would be useful. Now, of course, patrons request all kinds of random things that fall outside of, a public library mission, just things that you know you will never buy because they don't match your mission, no one else will use it. That's what interlibrary loan is for. But whenever possible, when it's a reasonable request, our answer is whenever possible that you should try and be able to order requests from patrons. Some review sources are free, and others, of course, you have to subscribe to. So I wanted to list some examples of both. The next slide covers some of the subscription options. So in addition to all of those diverse book blogs and websites we linked to in the module this week, here are some good choices for public libraries. Amazon is a good way to find out what's popular, but keep in mind that just like Goodreads, the reviews are written by the general public, and authors can even incentivize people to write good reviews, so they can be disingenuous. Still, both are a good way to get an idea of what a book is about, or just find titles to fill subject holes in a collection. Early Word is amazing, one of my favorites. One of the best features they have is just this link to a Google sheet of upcoming diversity titles. Early Word is also the home of Galley Chat, which is a monthly online discussion where library staff talk about upcoming books and what they think will be popular, or what their patrons are excited about, or what they are excited about. Library Journal is a subscription product, but their pre-pub alert is freely available online. It gives a great overview of the most anticipated upcoming titles, usually months in advance of their publication dates, so you can plan ahead to get those titles ordered. It covers both fiction and nonfiction titles. The New York Times Book Review page online requires a free account to log in and get the information, but with that free account you get a good amount of content. It isn't the entire New York Times Book Review, but it's a good way to see what's upcoming, what those books are about, and what's being hyped by publishers and booksellers, and librarians too. It covers both fiction and nonfiction as well. Book vendors like Baker & Taylor and Ingram, they also have publications about what's upcoming and what's popular. Baker & Taylor publishes a document called Forecast, and Ingram has lots of on-demand, hot topic, must-reads lists on their website. In most cases, your library will need to be a customer to get these extras. So look into whatever book vendor your library uses and see what review tools they provide, either in print or online. Midwest Tape is a vendor for music, movies, audiobooks, and they're also the company behind the streaming service called Hoopla. They have a Hot This Week flyer that comes in the mail, and it's also available on their website if you want to go print free or paper free. These are just a smattering of free review sources. So even TV shows like talk shows that interview authors and general interest magazines, they review books too. So that will give you a good start. So here's a list of some review sources that require subscriptions to access them. Some of these have come in and out of publication over the years. Magazines in general are a struggling format in the publishing industry, and review journals are no exception. So Voya, Voices of Youth Advocates, is one that ceased publication for a while and then it came back. So that is the case sometimes with these. Many of these sources provide some content freely on their website, like you saw on the previous slide, but you need a subscription for the rest. So it's worth looking to see what they do have freely available, even if it's just a snippet of the full content. It might give you an idea of titles to look into elsewhere. And again, this is just a sample of what's possible and what's available to libraries out there. Staff and patrons are fantastic people resources. So what expertise exists on your staff? What materials do they recommend? who is into crafting or marathon running or whatever, and what resources and authors do they recommend? Who among your staff has expertise in these topics? It doesn't have to be a librarian, just someone who knows their subject well. In fact, it doesn't even really need to be staff. You can ask your family too. Family are other great people resources. My husband is a pilot, he's a brewer, he's a sports fanatic, so he loves to recommend books and videos and even program topics for my library. It's really helpful because I don't necessarily know what's interesting to enthusiasts of those topics who may be library users. Are there flying and brewing magazines we should subscribe to? We get them at home, so sometimes I'll ask, is this something that you think would be interesting at the library? So ask the people around you, staff and the family, patrons even, for advice. So I mentioned patrons. Everyone has a Marge. Marge was a patron in a previous library who was just always ahead of the curve. Marge brought us in lists of books written usually on the back of junk mail envelopes. She was very resourceful. She would bring us these lists of titles that we might not have known about otherwise. She was always just enough ahead of the curve that she was looking for titles that, we might not have even given enough notice to. Maybe there was a review and it didn't really, catch our radar enough to think about buying it. If Marge requested it, we were always going to buy it because she just knew what people liked. So pay attention to what your patrons are telling you too. I mentioned previously, when a patron makes a request, try to honor it as often as you can, and you will figure out who your Marge is, who your patron is, who, always has a list for you, or who always seems to know what's going to be popular. Paying attention to and having an awareness of current events also helps you decide what to buy for your collection. Did something happen? Who are the experts weighing in on the topic? What have they written? Who are they citing? So patrons may ask for books when a recent celebrity dies. They're interested in the biographies of the celebrity. Hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, or after a big national incident like that, people are interested in those kinds of weather topics. They are interested in how to protect yourself in an active shooter situation, if that sort of thing happens as a current event. Geographical information on a country. Our patrons are currently interested in places like Ukraine and Israel, Palestine, things like that. So having information available because they've heard a lot about these countries in the news and they want more information about those countries. Of course, presidential election years, people get interested in all sorts of topics and about the candidates themselves as well. It gives you an idea in current events of what subjects can balance viewpoints on the topic too. So make sure you're paying attention to the experts on both sides of an issue so that you can build a well-rounded collection that acknowledges all the different viewpoints. So let's talk about fiction. And I mean fiction for all ages. So staying up to date on trends in genres, bestsellers, series, award winners, general fiction news, those websites I mentioned like Early Word, Goodreads, if you have access to the novelist database, they're great about keeping you up to date on trends. What are people interested in? What kind of series are out there? Again, the award winners. General fiction news. Is Oprah's book club reading? These are the things patrons want us to have on our shelves. Let's talk about classic fiction. My library generally focuses classic fiction on materials that are part of the local school curricula or that have constant demand. Things are not just, we don't just have it on a shelf because some white guy put it on a list and said it was a classic. That's not enough for us because a lot of that stuff will just sit there. And it's not of use to our patrons. We can get that stuff easily. Classic fiction, super easy to find, but we sometimes feel like we should have something versus need to have it. A lot of this stuff is available elsewhere. Just because you don't have a copy, of some Greek philosopher or whatever on your shelf in print doesn't mean you don't have access to it. Google Books, HathiTrust, Project Gutenberg, these are all places that have full text copies of a lot of classic fiction available to patrons. So keep in mind, pay attention to what is in the local school curricula. What are the homeschool parents teaching? What classic titles do people constantly ask for? To Kill a Mockingbird, my library is always going to have a ton of copies of that on the shelf. It's one that just constantly has demand and is considered classic fiction. So War and Peace is one of those. We feel like we should have it. It doesn't circulate well in our library, but we definitely have a copy on the shelf. We don't need more than one copy. It's not hurting anything by having the one copy, but it really does not circulate well. So decide what you should have, what you need to have, and what's just available elsewhere that you maybe don't need to have in print on the shelf. You have to know your community and your patrons and decide what falls into those categories. There's also a lot of talk in fiction about labeling, especially diverse books. Like, do you have an African American book section or an inspirational or Christian fiction book section, things like that. There are two sort of trains of thought on that. And one is that putting genre stickers and diversity labeling of books makes them easier to find for people who are looking for those windows opportunity, or I'm sorry, the mirrors opportunities, books that reflect them, that makes it easier for them to find books that reflect their experience. The other train of thought is that labeling things with diversity stickers sort of others them, separates them in some way from other, just good books versus normalizing them. My library, we don't use labels for diversity. We don't have, a Christian fiction sticker or, African American fiction sticker or anything like that. It just, in our community, it works better to go more of the Windows route. And we just interfile all of our fiction together when we do reader advisory and make book lists and displays. We pull from the entire collection. We don't other books or set them apart in some way by saying these books, the train of thought is that it can make people think that that book is not for them. If it's not their mirror, then it's not for them. We sort of focus on the Windows thing in our community because we are a very homogenous community. So we want to give our patrons a lot of opportunities to learn about other worldviews and lifestyles and cultures and things like that. So we just recommend books because they're good books, and we focus less on, we don't label them in any way for any specific audience. If you stumble on a book and the title sounds interesting and you like the cover, and the synopsis sounds interesting, a book is a book is a book. You may learn something about different people, and that's fantastic. We hope that happens, but we don't other those books by separating them in different shelving locations. That may work really well in other communities. I'm not saying that's wrong. I just want to point out that there are a couple of trains of thought on this, the labeling versus the not labeling. Find out what works well in your community and go that route. Once items are selected, they need to be purchased. So now that you know what to buy, let's talk about where to buy it. Acquisitions is the stage in the life cycle where libraries interact with outside vendors. Purchasers need to shop vendors for the best deals, of course, on shipping and delivery and ease of ordering. They'll want to consider which vendors offer replacements of items like cases or discs that come up missing or damaged later on. Items need to be able to be fixed, replaced, and reordered quickly and easily. So purchasers should know where to get the best quality items that will last a long time, arrive quickly, and ship and invoice efficiently. It's helpful if the acquisitions department, if there is one in your library, is included in the collection management policy, or perhaps even has its own acquisitions policy. The policy can list the vendors the library uses regularly, criteria for purchasing from a new vendor, what costs the library is willing to pay, like shipping or service fees, return policies, the number of copies a library will buy, or criteria for purchasing additional copies, how many holds need to be placed on an item, for example, in order to warrant buying another copy, and the use of purchase orders, credit cards, cash, staff reimbursement for library materials. It could also include whether or not the library is willing to consider adding used materials to its collection, either from sites like Amazon or Alibris or eBay, replacements maybe for items that are out of print. At what times will the library consider a used materials and in what specific kind of condition? Or from in-person donations of materials to the library too. What donations are they looking for? What donations will they accept? What will they not accept? What goes in the collection? What doesn't? All of these things can be part of an acquisitions policy, or just a collection development policy that acknowledges the acquisitions workflow. Here's an idea. You can save yourself from a ton of vendor visits throughout the year. My library sets up one day where vendors can come in a scheduled time slot to show you their materials. They have to stick to their time slot, and you can compare materials and vendors to each other more clearly because you dealt with them all on one day. So we may say, I don't know, Monday, May 12th or whatever is going to be vendor day. And so we invite all of our different book vendors. And I mean these, a lot of these are children's authors, to be honest. Our youth department does this the most commonly. They have book vendors that represent certain publishers and things like that. It's not for Amazon or Baker and Taylor or Ingram or our big jobbers. They're more for the independent, booksellers. So we invite them in, come and set up your books, let us shop the table. You get from 1 to 2 on Monday, May 12th. The next guy's coming in from 2 to 3. You have to stick to your time slot. We will happily look at your materials. We're probably going to buy stuff. We're going to save a certain chunk of our budget for vendor day. And that keeps them from just calling us at random all year long. Vendors like to pick the worst possible times to call you. I'm on the reference desk. I can't talk right now. I'm headed to a meeting. I can't talk right now. They won't just send an email. I get a vendor call and I say, I'm happy to look at your catalog. Please send me a link and I'll look at it when I have the time. They always want to talk about the weather. How's the weather up there in Michigan? We're in Texas. Well, it's February. How do you think the weather is? It's easy to get a little salty with vendors because it's an inconvenient time. Doesn't mean we don't want their materials or that they don't have good things to offer. We just like a vendor day to put it all on one planned day of interaction. They don't call us at random in February to ask us to look at their books. We say vendor days in May. Why don't you send a rep? We'll set you up a table. We'll come and shop. We'll see what we like. Other places to buy. Amazon can be cheap. They have quick delivery. They are not a library vendor. They don't provide MARC records. They don't provide replacements. They did recently add more library-friendly services, like the ability to connect invoices to purchase orders or specific order lines or account numbers. They're getting better about that kind of thing, but they're still not specifically a library vendor. They're convenient. When we need an extra copy quick, or sometimes we like to buy our book club copies that we give out to people to keep, because they're cheap and they're quick to get our stuff. That's generally what we use Amazon for. There are other library vendors that you can use for your main book orders. Baker and Taylor, there's Ingram, there's Follett, Midwest Tape, recorded books, there's a ton of them. I'd be interested to know in the discussion this week what kind of library vendors your library uses. Maybe you have great deals that the rest of us want to know about, or new vendors that do good work that we want to know about. So I'd be interested to know what kind of library vendors your library uses. So that was where to buy. Now let's talk about when to buy. Regular orders can be staggered so that technical services staff can keep up with the work coming in. Communication between departments is key. For example, if a youth department in a public library needs a particular item to arrive in time to present a special program, purchasers need to know that. Don't sit on this order. I gotta have these books for the book club in time. It's also on the librarians to place the order in a reasonable amount of time so that they're not constantly rushing the purchasers through their part of the workflow. Or if several copies of a particular title are needed for a class, faculty needs to make that known to the college library's purchasers. Timing is also important in regards to the relevancy and the currency of the items being purchased. So when a selector chooses an item for a collection, they expect the item to be available to library users in a timely fashion. If the acquisitions department doesn't place the order, the technical services staff does not prepare the item for circulation, and the shelving staff don't get the item onto the shelves, the whole item may become irrelevant before library users ever have access to it. In public libraries, national bestsellers need to be made available to the public quickly while they're still popular and still in demand. In special libraries, in fields like law or medicine, currency is absolutely crucial, even life-altering. They have to have those materials when they're hot off the presses. New materials have to be made available to library users as quickly as possible in order to stay relevant and current. Purchasing digital content usually requires a contract. Someone will need to have the authority to sign these agreements, which often deal with remote access, expiration date of the service, and large amounts of money. Some databases cost tens of thousands of dollars or more. Again, cross-departmental communication is crucial in these cases. Selectors may only want a certain portion of a database or a certain format of an ebook, which purchasers need to know when setting up those contracts. IT departments may need to get involved to set up modes of authenticating users remotely for access to the digital materials. So all parties should understand whether the library owns the digital content or simply leases access to content owned by the vendor. These are some of the things to think about when you're purchasing digital content. Patron-driven acquisition, or PDA, is a tool more and more libraries are taking advantage of. There are several models of patron-driven acquisition in which the materials that are selected and ultimately acquired for the collection are triggered by patron requests. They can be initiated by interlibrary loan requests or through catalog browsing or other ways. A library can make titles discoverable, and when a patron selects them through the library catalog or the database, it actually activates library purchase of the item. There's different ways to set this up so that you have final say on what gets purchased and what doesn't. Some of the stuff is moderated. There's an entire module devoted to collection budget, so we won't say much about it here, but it is part of the acquisitions process. Since no library has an unlimited budget and unlimited space, budgets indicate our priorities. Maybe new collections will need some serious startup money to get going, and maybe other collections aren't as critical. Remember back when we talked about things like current events? Maybe this is causing us to put more money into one thing and less money into something else. A good example was the pandemic. Our library started putting more resources into electronic collections while we were closed, and we didn't fund print until we opened again. This can happen in a smaller way at a local level. When a major employer in a community lays people off, the need for career materials might go up, and things like travel or other luxury pastimes might go down. A director is going to say to department heads, here's your pile of money for the collection. Those department heads will then divide out the pile of money into areas of the collection into line items. That could be by department, adult, teen, youth. It could also be divided by format. Usually this division is based on how the library is organized and how the collection is divided by the librarians in charge. Generally, the larger the library and the staff, the more divided and detailed the budget. A librarian might be in charge of a collection and have a line item indicating how much money they have to spend on their particular part of the collection for the next fiscal year. More on all of this in the budget module. Purchase orders are a tracking system for every purchase from paper towels in the restroom to a book order. Everything the library purchases is associated with a purchase order if you have a purchase order system. The purchase order number is assigned by your accounting system, and it tracks that number to every vendor order all the way through the summary in the financial statements at the end of the year. So you can look up any purchase order number and see where the items were purchased and exactly what was purchased. When was it purchased? When did it arrive? How much did we pay for it? Libraries may also have credit cards available for the acquisitions process. Credit cards are just a different way of paying the bills. The same purchase order, and other procedures have to be followed. Purchase order systems and other record-keeping procedures are essential because it prevents fraud and it shows transparency to the public and the board about how money is being spent. And again, we'll go into much more detail on all of these topics in the library budgets module. Processing makes items ready for library shelves, such as labels, barcodes, covers, cases, all of that sort of thing. Processing and cataloging, we've lumped them together here in the life cycle model because they directly relate to each other. Processing rules need to make sense for each collection. So the sticker placement should make items easier to use. So they shouldn't cover up important information like the title or the author's name. Processing should help, not hinder the use of a collection. If you see the picture on the slide here, it's ridiculous the number of stickers on this book. And the new sticker is right in the middle. So when this book isn't new or a 7-day loan anymore, there's a weird gap on the spine there. So that's a bit much. Processing should help, not hinder the use of a collection. So some things to consider include, do cases have locks that are easy to set or easy to open? Are spine labels printed in a font size that most people can see? Do the words on the spine labels make sense? Do they match the words in the item's catalog record? Are there plastic covers and tape on the items to protect them? How about labels that identify the owning library and barcode numbers on various parts? Cataloging rules also need to make sense for each collection and even for each library or even each branch of a library. Our library also catalogs children's nonfiction animal books by the animal name rather than by the author. So here's an example of a way we've made sense of cataloging for a specific collection in our library. So for example, books about dolphins in the children's department, they're all together under the call number 599.5 dolphin. Books about tigers are under 599.75 tiger. It puts all of those animal books together. It makes them easier for kids to find. We also did this for Shakespeare plays in the adult department. We catalog Shakespeare plays under the title of the play, rather than all of them scattered under the traditional call number of 822.33 Shakespeare. You can find all available editions of Romeo and Juliet under 822.33 Romeo. Macbeth is under 822.33 Macbeth. Othello under 822.33 Othello, etc. So instead of digging through lots and lots of Shakespeare to find the one you want, and they're all, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth and Othello are all interfiled here and there and everywhere, this puts all the Romeo and Juliets together, all the Macbeths together, etc. It works pretty well for us. Once items are processed and cataloged, they're ready to be shelved. So shelving implications for a quality collection include accuracy, shelf space, size, and timing. Starting with accuracy. Accuracy in shelving is crucial. When the library catalog points users to a particular section to find an item, the users expect to find the item there. So misshelved items cause frustration for library staff and for patrons. Shelf reading is an important activity that library shelving staff usually undertake. They go through the items one at a time, putting them back in order because sections get out of order. In my library in the youth department, those animal books I was talking about, they get messy. It's a lot easier to put them back together because those animals are all together on the shelf, but they do get messy. Shelf space is an ongoing struggle for many libraries. In order to add something new, they might have to actually take something away. Knowing how many items exist in a collection and what percentage of those items is checked out at any given time can help manage shelf space. The size of items to be shelved is another consideration when managing a collection. Libraries might need to create an oversized item collection so that they can be put in a place where shelf space is appropriate to large items. Moving oversized items out of the general collection can extend the life of the items since they can be shelved comfortably. Putting them sideways on regular shelves can cause them to stick out into the aisles. So people and carts run into them, making the items fall to the floor, breaking their spines, bending the pages, and other physical problems. And of course, the trip hazard is the worst part of all of that. The reverse, very small books pose their own problems. Tiny books tend to get lost on the shelves. They fall behind the shelves. They can get misplaced by patrons who check them out, and it puts them at high risk for circulation issues. So these are just some of the things to consider when shelving materials. Once the collection is on the shelf, it's ready for library patrons. Use includes browsing and checkout. The point of a library collection is to make information available to people. So a library, a quality collection is one that library patrons actually use. The checkout procedure is also part of use. What items can be checked out and for how long? Can you put something on hold? Are new items treated differently? Being familiar with the circulation system is also helpful in understanding all the aspects of use. Use also includes the idea of accessibility. This is more than just having materials in a variety of formats. It also includes how easy items are for patrons to find. Can you reach them? Is signage clear? What is the process for getting a library card or checking out an item? How easy is it to find electronic materials? Use also extends to computers in the library website, bulletin boards, programming, everything that the library offers to the public. Think about all of the aspects of using a library. Are the stacks wide enough to accommodate a wheelchair or a double stroller? Can low vision people use the computer or access the website easily? How about non-English speakers? Are there materials for them? Is there signage in commonly spoken languages in your community? Using a library is more than just checking out a book. Everything from the library's digital presence to signing up for a story time or getting a library card is part of the use process. The point is making sure that we look at use of a collection beyond the concept of materials. How we locate those materials, find those materials, interact with the building they are housed in, it's all part of use. So remember that just having an item is more than just purchasing and shelving. How it is presented and accessed is very much a part of this process. Take a look on the screen at these 3 examples. We have Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl, a computer programming book from the late 1960s, and a book about how to build a nuclear fallout shelter. All of these will lead into our discussion of weeding. If you remember from the life cycle, repair and maintenance is the last step before we weed. So what do we repair and what does maintenance mean in this context? Let's take a look at the first title, The Diary of a Young Girl. This is a picture of an actual paperback that I retrieved before it was reshelved. You can tell it's falling apart. More than once in my career, I've had staff bring me a title in this condition and ask me if they think we can repair it. That was a paperback. It was probably worth about $4 brand new at the time. Spending staff time at $15 an hour and miles of tape to heroically save this paperback is just foolish. This is my example of weed it and replace it with a new copy. This is considered a seminal work, and there will be many times in the library's history where this title will be replaced and upgraded with a new copy. So now look at the computer programming book in the middle. This book was from the late 1960s. This is when we replace with a new, more current title. The topic of computer programming is still relevant, but the title is obviously very out of date. In public library nonfiction collections, this is most likely to happen in areas like medicine, science, technology, and law. New information makes older titles irrelevant. Finally, on the right is a book about fallout shelters. Even if this was a hot topic 70 years ago, I doubt there is much call for such a book now. Even if you have a patron walk in tomorrow wanting to build a fallout shelter, this book is too old to address modern building materials or other construction issues. There are plans out there that you can buy for modern day bomb shelters, but unless that's important to your patrons, you can probably let this one go and not bother replacing it. This leads us to the end of our life cycle discussion, weeding. At the repair and maintenance point, we made the decision to repair, replace, or let a title go. Once an item no longer meets the needs of the library's users or no longer matches the library's mission or its collection policy, it should be removed from the collection. A quality collection is highly dependent upon weeding to remove those items that are bringing the collection down. We have dedicated an entire module to this phase of the life cycle, so we'll leave it at that for now. This overview is to give you a sense that there are lots of moving parts to library collections, and it's important to make sure that you are being efficient with your time and the time of your coworkers. Even if you have only a small part of this process, it's a team effort to make sure all the working parts of the life cycle deliver the best collection. Each stage of the collection life cycle presents opportunities to evaluate and improve its quality. So we've described various techniques for managing collections at each stage of the life cycle and suggested ways to gather information about a collection status. Managing collections holistically takes each stage of the collection life cycle into consideration when making decisions, and recognizes that each stage of the life cycle has implication for each of the other stages of the life cycle. As always, we have lots of articles and links for discussion and exploration in the module. A sample discussion post I had asked earlier about the vendors your libraries use, but also where are some areas of overlap between sections of the collection life cycle? How do the actions in one part of the life cycle affect the outcomes in another part of the life cycle? Everything is connected, and if one thing falls apart, it has ramifications for the rest of the process and other departments' workflows. So what are some examples of those overlaps? Have a great week, everybody.